Thank you all for having me here this morning. Like Andy said, I've been a scouting volunteer with the Boy Scouts for 20 years and also spent 30 years with the Girl Scouts. But the common thread was always my love of the outdoors. I started backpacking in the 70s and never really stopped. I didn't have the nerve to embark on an Appalachian Trail through hike when I was right out of college. The pressure to establish a career and then, home and family and all those things sort of got in the way. But a few years ago, I retired from a park system job, and I started on the adventure of a lifetime. So let me see if I can't share some pictures with you and some stories of what it was like to hike the Appalachian Trail. So if you're not familiar with it, the Appalachian Trail runs up the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and it's over 2,000 miles long from Springer Mountain in Georgia to Mount Katahdin in Maine. It varies a little bit year to year because of different reroutes, but the year that I hiked, the total mileage officially was 2,189.8 miles. It took me 155 days to do that, carrying the pack that's in the photo there. My pack weighed about 36 pounds. There is a little bit of jargon that I'll probably fall into. The first term is a zero, which is a day that you don't hike at all. So there were 10 days out of that 155 when I didn't actually hike. There were 8 nights that I met up with family and friends and stayed in a motel room, and about 11 nights that I stayed at hiker hostels. But the rest of that time I camped out. I started my journey on April 4th at Springer Mountain, which is in a state park in Georgia at Amicalola Falls. And there's the plaque at the southern terminus of the trail. The nights that I stayed in camp, about half of them I stayed in a shelter, and I believe there are several trail shelters in here. So they're varying designs. Some are wood, some are stone, some are much more elaborate than others. These are scattered along the trail, more common in some states than others. There are about half a dozen of them right here in New Jersey. And they're mostly 3-sided shelters that are available first come, first serve for hikers to stay in. When you get up into New Hampshire, this particular shelter, I'm not sure you can tell, but it has 6 sides. There are some very unique shelters and facilities that are maintained by the Dartmouth Outing Club, the engineers out playing in the woods. And this is actually a private cabin that was made available just off the trail, which had this wonderful observation deck where you could watch the sunset behind the Green Mountains and watch it rise the next morning behind the White Mountains. So that was quite late in the trip. And this is one of the managed cabins run by the Appalachian Mountain Club, for which there was a small fee, but this was a chance to get in out of the weather. Actually, rolling into that cabin, I had hiked for 3 days in the rain, and my feet were quite torn up from hiking in wet boots. In the beginning, the shelters tend to be crowded. This is down in the Smoky Mountains at Easter time with a bunch of the thru hikers entertaining one another. The young man standing up was actually carrying a bagpipe trainer and practicing along the trail. And one of the hiking traditions is to get up and watch the sunrise at Clingman's Dome, which is the highest point along the trail and is within Smoky Mountain National Park. So I was not sure I was going to get up and do that because I didn't want to hike the 3 miles in the dark, but most of the people staying in the shelter did, so I got up and tagged along, and it was quite spectacular. A lot of inside jokes come up to keep people going. This large teddy bear was hitchhiking its way up the trail, so different people were volunteering to carry Veronica from shelter to shelter. Hostels, I mentioned before, there are some inexpensive lodging options available outside some of the parks and towns, and this was the first hostel that I stayed in. stayed in a handful of them, not as many as a lot of the hikers did. This was one of my favorites up in Maine. The hostels charge anywhere from, well, there are donation hostels. Some of them charge up to $35 or $40, but they give you a chance to sleep in a real bed, take a shower, do laundry, sometimes even get a hot meal. About half of the nights that I was out, though, I camped in a what they call a stealth site, where you would just find a flat piece of ground and set up your little backpacking tent, and that would give you a chance to really be alone in the woods. My tent gave out about a month into the hike, and I ended up replacing it with this tent. Almost everybody would carry an ultralight one-person tent. They weigh about 2 pounds, and they don't give you much space, which is why most people would sleep in a combination of accommodations. And that was one of my favorite campsites. It's actually one I've been back to revisit, in an area called the 100-Mile Wilderness up in Maine, where you really do hike for a week without crossing any roads or having any access to a town. Feeding yourself. I made the choice to plan out all my meals ahead of time, and my husband helped me by mailing them to me. So that was 20-some boxes of shelf-stable food that I picked up at post offices that were close to the trail. The trail goes through several towns, the most famous of which is Damascus. Damascus, Virginia has marketed itself as being a trail-friendly town. They hold a big hiker festival. That particular sidewalk is going through Hot Springs, North Carolina. But some of the small trails in the south really go out of their way to make the hikers feel welcome, in the hopes that we'll stay in town and spend money, I'm sure. But a lot of hiker feeds, spaghetti dinners, pancake breakfasts, public parks where you can charge your phone or fill your water bottles or spend the night. That was a shelter that I stayed in at a very developed park in Virginia. Beautiful accommodations. There was a dumpster, there were outlets, there was running water. There was also a freight train that they didn't warn me about that ran all night long just behind that pavilion. This is probably the northernmost town where I hit a really organized hiker festival. This is in Duncannon, Pennsylvania, which was a very depressed town, but they actually had a hiker days where local businesses came out, and they really encouraged the hikers and other people who were interested in the outdoors to just come out and support local businesses, support the hikers. There were contests and food, music. Another thing that people do to support the hikers is what they call trail magic. And trail magic is any sort of a gift or an act of kindness that's designed to help the hikers. And this was my favorite setup. There was a cooler with beverages on ice. The other cooler was not cold, but it was like dry storage for snacks, and then a 5-gallon bucket so you could put your trash in there and keep the animals out of it. You can see there was a note. This particular act of trail magic was from a previous hiker who just left a supportive note and a little treat for people who were walking through. And this was probably the most elaborate, definitely the most elaborate trail magic I ran into. I rolled into this campsite late in the evening and found an entire mountain man encampment there. And I was disappointed because I really wanted to camp there. It was early in my hike. It was my first 20-mile day. And then the fellow said, "Oh no, we've only taken over this big spot. There are all kinds of small tent spaces." He showed me a place to put my tent. He had dinner, he had coffee. They had come in, they were from the Christian Camping Fellowship. He explained it to me as being this organization was to the Royal Rangers what the Order of the Arrow is to the Boy Scouts. This is sort of their elite team from a church fellowship group. And they had seen Trail Magic performed somewhere else and thought it was so much fun, they decided to make it part of their program. So they cooked dinner and breakfast, and they had snacks, and they had journals. They wanted stories from the hikers, and that was a wonderful surprise once I realized what was going on. And this is another elaborate Trail Magic. There was a fellow up in New England that cooked omelets to order every day all through the season. He hiked into a service road with his dog and cooked for the hikers. There was even Trail Magic left for one of the trail dogs. And these were some folks that I finished the trail with, and they had received Trail Magic from one of their friends that finished ahead of them, actually left them a little treasure hunt on the summit of Mount Katahdin, and they found a cache of treats up there with a note congratulating them. So the trail is beautiful, rolling country in a lot of places. You're living out in the weather. There's some pretty violent storms, forest fires. There had been a major fire on the trail the year before my hike, and we hiked through a lot of that damage down in North Carolina. But we also were interrupted by a small active fire. It was about a 5-mile stretch that the Forest Service closed because of the fire and actually bussed us around. When they put us back on the trail, again, there was Trail Magic. There were 2 impressions I had after during my hike. One was the huge amount of support for hikers. The other was the crowds. I wasn't expecting either one of those. This shot here is a swollen stream, and my slides don't reflect the amount of rain that we had in 2017. This stream you were supposed to cross by walking on rocks, which if you look closely through the center of the screen, you can see there are rocks under 5 or 6 inches of rushing water. Many of the stream crossings on the trail are either fords or places where you walk across on rocks. A lot of streams don't have bridges, and that does take some getting used to, especially in April when the water is still cold. This is Mcafee Knob, is supposed to be the most photographed spot on the trail. This is down in Virginia, and it was made famous by the movie A Walk in the Woods. But everybody goes out on that rock outcropping and poses for pictures. Fantastic view in Southern Virginia. And this puzzled me, the handicapped parking at the trail access, because there was literally nothing at this particular parking lot, not a bathroom facility, nothing but a cattle gate, which was not handicapped accessible, into a field. So I'm not really sure what the point of the parking space was. As you get up into Pennsylvania, you're hiking through a lot of agricultural land, and then you run into the Pennsylvania rocks. There's a hiking legend of the northernmost 60 miles in the state of Pennsylvania is extremely rocky. And this was a little bit further north. One of the simplest solutions to a small cliff on the trail, they just cabled an aluminum extension ladder into the trail. Another example of trail conditions. In New Hampshire, you come up to the sign warning you that the trail you're about to go down can be dangerous. But you don't really have any option by the time you're looking at this sign. Another example of trail conditions, the actual official trail for crossing the Kennebec River in Maine is a free canoe service. They call it the Kennebec Ferry. And they actually painted a blaze in the bottom of the canoe for people who want to touch every white blaze. You're discouraged from trying to cross this stream because it's downstream from a hydroelectric dam, and they have unscheduled releases. So several years back, somebody was killed trying to cross this river, and the canoe became the official means of crossing. Of course, living out in the woods for 6 months or 5 months, you encounter a lot of wildlife. That's a spruce grouse from up in New England. Those are the what they call wild ponies. Wild is a bit of an overstatement, but there is a state park down in Virginia that has ponies that have been introduced to maintain the open nature of the land. And they're very accustomed to the hikers. They beg, they'll come up and lick the sweat off of you, looking for salt. But they were a fun surprise. The little fellow I found in the shrubs on the side of the trail one day that I was short on food and looking for blackberries. And I was amazed that he let me get so close to him until I looked at the picture and realized his eyes were, his eye scales were clouded over. He must have been getting ready to shed. That's the only photo I got of a bear. I encountered 7 bears on the trail, but generally they would run just far enough that you couldn't get a decent picture. We were very aware of the bear problems on the trail. Some of the shelters have been closed. That becomes an ongoing problem as bears learn that they can get food from hikers. And they become more brazen and more problems arise. Every year there are a handful of shelters that are closed due to bear activity. Every 100 miles, every landmark, the hikers tend to make little signs to celebrate having gotten that far. 1,000 miles hits just before you come into the town of Harpers Ferry, which is another big trail town. My son met me down in Harpers Ferry. Again, continuing north, you hit the Mason-Dixon line, and then the official halfway point. And I apologize for the glare on this picture, but I included it to make the point that just as the total distance changes from year to year over reroutes, the official halfway point shifts slightly. And I hit it late in the afternoon and couldn't avoid the glare on it. But there is a more arbitrary halfway point that's approximate, that has a more permanent monument for photos. One of the hiker traditions is when you get to the halfway point of the trail, you celebrate being halfway along by doing what they call the half-gallon challenge. There's a camp store at a state park in Pennsylvania that encourages you to try and eat a half-gallon of ice cream in one sitting. The unfortunate part is that half-gallons of ice cream are no longer a half-gallon. They're like 3 pints. So you have to eat the large container, and then you have to eat another 16-ounce container. And all of the thru hikers that I knew that tried it had no problem eating half a gallon of ice cream. In eating it, not everybody enjoyed the rest of the day afterward. It's probably not a good idea, but when you hike 15, 18 miles every day, carrying a pack in the mountains, there is what they call hiker hunger. After 3 or 4 weeks on the trail, the hikers become all about finding food. Town food is a big treat. You eat everything in sight. Every hiker I knew had a jar of peanut butter in their pack at all times and would just eat straight peanut butter when they were low on calories. So this was just a fun tradition to try and get some extra calories. Continuing north, we saw all these great handmade signs, routed wooden signs. When you hit the New Jersey state line, it's literally stenciled on the side of Route 80, on the bridge crossing the Delaware River. It kind of sets the tone for what people expect when they hit New Jersey. The hikers that I hiked with, nobody was looking forward to New Jersey. Everybody had these preconceived ideas that it was going to be crowded, it was going to be dirty, it was going to be ugly. To a hiker, everyone was commenting, because they knew I was from New Jersey. They were commenting on how pleasantly surprised they were, what a pretty state it was, how easy the hiking was, the access to food. So I've got several slides of just some of the iconic trail locations in New Jersey. The southernmost facility run by the Appalachian Mountain Club is on the AT in New Jersey. Is one of our fire towers. This is a CCC stone shelter that was built on top of Sunrise Mountain up in North Jersey. And most of the shelters in New Jersey are stone shelters. Of course, the High Point Monument. This is a stretch that when I started backpacking was a horrible long road walk. And they've built a half-mile of boardwalking through this swamp that makes now the Pochuck. The Pochuck Boardwalk is one of the features people look for, with this huge elaborate bridge to get you through some wetlands up in North Jersey. Brings you right up to the New Jersey-New York state line. This is more typical of how state lines are marked. And as you move into New York, Breakneck Ridge has had a flag flying on it ever since the September 11th attacks, maintained by a hiking club. The Lemon Squeezer up in Harriman State Park is one of the really well-known features in our part of the country. And this was a newly remodeled trail shelter in Harriman State Park. Unfortunately, this shelter was having trouble with an aggressive bear. And while people were enjoying it during the day, I don't know anybody that chose to camp there. My old hiking buddy met me also in Harriman. She brought me one of my resupply boxes and hiked with me for a day. When you come to major rivers or major highways, the trail reroutes onto existing roads. And so this is the bridge at Bear Mountain going across the Hudson River. And here's one of the official mileage signs. And even that far into it, the signage is all still biased toward people hiking north. That's by far the most common. 85% of the people who attempt a through hike start in Georgia and hike toward Maine. The terrain is a lot more difficult in northern New England, and you can start earlier in the spring. The northern terminus of the trail, Mount Katahdin in Maine, is in a state park, and they don't open the trails above tree line until they're snow free. So right now you still cannot be hiking on Mount Katahdin this season. They try to get it open by Memorial Day, but they had pretty good snowpack up there this year, so they're not sure that's going to work. Whereas at the Georgia end, people start as early as February. When you get into New England, you're hiking across a lot of ski mountains, so the trail has certainly a different feel. And this would be in the White Mountains, which are one of the most spectacular sections of the trail and something that everybody's looking forward to as they hike. In the White Mountains, the Appalachian Mountain Club maintains a few huts, which are hike-in facilities open to weekend guests. They're rather expensive. They're beautiful facilities. I've stayed in them often. You go in there and get dinner served. You get a breakfast that's served to you. They're tight, well-maintained buildings where you get to share a bunk room with 30 or 40 smelly strangers. But they have a wonderful atmosphere of enjoying the mountains and making them accessible to everybody. The folks sitting on the front porch are the through hikers who had asked about doing what they call work for stay at this hut. The folks on the left-hand side of the door are the ones who were given the chance. What they do for the through hikers, since the huts are normally full and they're often above tree line where it's not really safe to camp, when you're through hiking, if you roll in there at about 4 p.m, they take a handful of through hikers and let them work for stay, which basically means if you come in and help with the dishes, they let you eat leftovers and sleep on the floor. The people to the right-hand side of the door arrived too late and were turned away and told they had to go camp in the rain. So they're hanging out on the porch, trying to stay out of the rain until it's time to go to bed. That was a breeding knot of garter snakes that I ran into outside of one of the huts. This picture is taken also in the White Mountains, outside of or above Crawford Notch. And I really included this picture because of the person who took it. I climbed up that mountain and on that ridge found somebody who was wearing a Wounded Warrior Project t-shirt. And I didn't really think it through. I asked if he was promoting awareness or raising money for the Wounded Warrior Project, and it turned out he was a client, which is why I did not take his picture. But he told me, at this point, we're 1,700 miles into the trail. And he told me, he said, last week was the first time that I woke up and thought that the world was a beautiful place and life was worth living. So this time in nature really was healing for him. That left a profound impression on me to know that he had done everything that I had done over the last several months and done it while he was miserable. I couldn't imagine what that felt like to just wake up every morning for 4 months. And obviously since he was suffering from PTSD, that this hike was nothing compared to experiences he'd had earlier in his life. But that made quite an impression on me. Again, crossing the White Mountains, the Presidential Range has the reputation for some of the worst weather in the world. You hike right over the top of Mount Washington, which is interesting because Mount Washington is one of those mountains that tourists can drive right up. It has a cog railroad, so you can run into huge crowds on nice days. I didn't summit on a nice day, so it's kind of a mixed blessing. But yeah, there's the cog running past the summit building. And this is 6,000 feet above sea level and miles into a fairly primitive area. So it's sort of unexpected. This is what the hiking terrain looks like through the Presidentials. Right after the Presidentials, you hit what they consider to be the hardest mile of the trail, the Mahousik Notch. The trail just winds its way through this notch filled with large boulders. And they say that you should allow anywhere from 2 to 4 hours to hike that 1 mile. Well, it took me 2 hours and 20 minutes. And there are several places where you have to take your pack off and push it up the rock ahead of yourself. And just finding the trail, the blazes were somewhat faded, so it was kind of interesting to figure out, if you go through the wrong crevice, you end up in a spot where you dead end. But you come out the other side to this beautiful pond, and I would say the southern Maine portion of the trail was my favorite. It was actually the first portion that I went back and rehiked. I mentioned before the 100-mile wilderness. It's well marked. You hit a trail town called Munson, Maine, and then there's nothing until you get almost to Mount Katahdin. And it's not as wilderness as it used to be. There are private camps, there are logging roads. Basically what it means is there are no public roads, there are no towns. But it is gorgeous hiking. I saw moose, I saw fisher, I saw pine martens. I had a meal with an immature bald eagle. It really is an incredible place to hike. Those are the famous Maine blueberries, the tiny little low bush blueberries. And I think I ate fresh blueberries every day that I was in Maine. And that surprised me that there were several bogs in Maine, but to run into the pitcher plants and the sundews on the side of the trail was not something I anticipated. That's moose scat. The first southbound hiker I encountered, I think I met him in Vermont, and he told me that the trail in Maine was 280 miles of moose droppings. That was a slight exaggeration, but only a slight one. But I did finally see a moose. And then you get your first good look at Mount Kachadan. Mount Katahdin's not the highest mountain on the trail, but it sits on the floor of this valley, so it's very dramatic. And it was considered sacred by the Penobscot Indians. So you roll up at the end of the 100-mile wilderness to this logging road and get this spectacular view of it. And this is what the trail up Katahdin looks like. And that was my summit picture. Everybody poses with that sign once they finish their trail.